In under 3 years, Burkina Faso is presented as moving from survival mode to a nationwide build-out. Across agriculture, health, education, roads and sport, the narrative stresses initiatives meant to accelerate local, inclusive development, while security pressures persist. Ibrahim Traoré is framed as the driver, yet the sharper question is practical. Do these programs turn citizen mobilization into measurable, lasting capacity at scale? The promise is big, and the timeline is tight. Next comes the promise and the stakes attached to it. The initiatives described are not presented as isolated projects, but as an integrated attempt to change how development is delivered in Burkina Faso. Agriculture, health, education, infrastructure, and sport are treated as linked systems, where progress in one is expected to reinforce the others. The promise is straightforward: faster execution, stronger local participation, and outcomes that remain even if external support fluctuates. The stakes are equally high. If these initiatives succeed, they suggest a viable model of endogenous development under constraint. If they stall, the risk is fragmentation, uneven impact, and fatigue among communities as to mobilize repeatedly. Timing matters because expectations are already visible on the ground. What follows will examine whether the structure, sequencing, and early results justify that confidence, or whether gaps are already forming beneath the momentum. What sits beneath the volume of announcements is this: these initiatives were designed less as substitutes for ministries and more as accelerators layered on top of existing sector policies. Rather than rebuilding governance from scratch, the approach emphasizes rapid execution, centralized coordination, and visible outputs that communities can immediately engage with. This framing explains why projects appear simultaneously across unrelated sectors, yet follow a similar logic of mobilization, co-production, and accountability. In this context, Ibrahim Traoré is not presented primarily as a technocratic planner, but as the political anchor of a sequencing strategy. Security stabilization, citizen engagement, and material delivery are advanced in parallel, not sequentially. The bet is that waiting for perfect conditions would lock the country into stagnation. Instead, the initiatives push forward under constraint, accepting friction as a cost of speed. The background matters. Burkina Faso faces territorial pressure, fiscal limits, and high social expectations. Against that baseline, even modest infrastructure or service gains can generate outsized perception effects. Community-led roadworks, subsidized agricultural inputs, or upgraded health centers function not only as services, but as signals that the state is present and acting. The point is this: the model prioritizes momentum over optimization. Early visibility is treated as a resource in itself, meant to reinforce trust, participation, and patience. Whether that momentum compounds or dissipates becomes the central question driving the rest of the analysis. The early effects of the initiatives become clear when viewed through concrete, localized experiences rather than national summaries. In several communities, the first visible changes are modest but immediate. Rehabilitated communal infrastructure, sanitation campaigns, small-scale roadworks, and support for locally designed projects. These actions are intentionally labor-intensive, relying on volunteerism, youth engagement, and community leadership rather than large external contractors. This choice shapes perception. For residents, participation itself becomes part of the outcome. Cleaning public spaces, maintaining drainage, or contributing materials creates a sense of ownership that purely top-down delivery often fails to generate. The initiatives therefore function as social organizers as much as development programs, rebuilding habits of collective action that had weakened under prolonged insecurity and economic stress. Ibrahim Traoré appears in this layer less as a distant decision-maker and more as a symbolic reference point. His role is invoked to legitimize local action and signal political backing, not to manage implementation details. The emphasis is on decentralizing effort while keeping the narrative centralized. Communities act, but within a shared national frame. The immediate impact is uneven. Urban areas and regional capitals tend to benefit first, while rural zones face delays linked to access, security, or coordination capacity. Still, even partial delivery produces early feedback loops. Visible progress encourages further participation, while participation lowers implementation costs and speeds execution. So what does that mean in practice? It is direct. Early, tangible engagement matters more than scale at this stage. The initiatives prioritize trust building through action, betting that social momentum can precede and eventually enable more complex structural change. The event flow of the presidential initiatives follows a clear three-phase pattern: activation, peak, and aftershock. Activation begins with formal adoption and public framing. Programs are announced with defined scopes, short timelines, and a strong emphasis on national urgency. This phase is communication-heavy, designed to synchronize ministries, local authorities, and communities around a shared direction. The language consistently stresses speed, ownership, and patriotic responsibility rather than procedural caution. The peak phase is where delivery becomes visible. In agriculture, subsidized inputs, equipment distribution, and training programs are rolled out simultaneously. In health, construction and upgrading of medical centers move alongside equipment acquisition and staffing plans. Education initiatives combine infrastructure projects with transport solutions and institutional reforms. Road and urban development efforts emphasize labor-intensive methods, while sport investments focus on facilities and talent pipelines. The common feature is concurrency. Multiple sectors advance at once, creating a sense of national movement rather than isolated progress. Ibrahim Traoré is most prominent at this stage as a unifying reference rather than a hands-on executor. His presence anchors the narrative of coherence. The initiatives are repeatedly framed as extensions of a single vision, even when implementation is delegated across different actors. This reduces the risk of sectoral silos in public perception, even if coordination challenges remain behind the scenes. The aftershock phase begins once initial delivery meets operational reality, maintenance demands surface, coordination gaps appear, and expectations rise faster than capacity in some areas. Communities that receive early benefits often ask for expansion, while those still waiting question sequencing choices. This phase is less visible in official messaging, but critical for sustainability. It tests whether systems for follow-up, evaluation, and adjustment are strong enough to prevent momentum from stalling. The overall sequence reveals a deliberate trade-off. Speed is prioritized over refinement in the early stages, with the assumption that visible action will buy time and trust for later correction. The risk is that unresolved aftershocks accumulate. The opportunity is that early gains create political and social space to absorb them. This tension defines the trajectory of the initiatives going forward. The strongest quantitative signals appear in agriculture, where the initiatives move beyond intent into measurable inputs and outputs. The baseline problem is familiar: limited mechanization, high input costs, and low productivity among vulnerable producers. The response focuses on lowering entry barriers at scale. Hundreds of tractors are deployed to support land preparation, with services provided free to targeted farmers. Improved seeds are distributed with heavy subsidies, shifting most of the cost burden away from producers. Fertilizers follow the same model, priced at a fraction of market rates to stabilize excess during critical planting periods. The delta is visible in volume rather than efficiency alone. Over multiple seasons, thousands of tons of improved seeds and fertilizers are introduced into the system. This changes not just yields, but planning behavior. Farmers who previously minimized risk by underplanting can commit larger surfaces, knowing inputs will arrive. Complementary training programs for young agricultural entrepreneurs reinforce this shift, linking production with basic management and processing skills. The objective is not only more output, but a more predictable production cycle. Processing data adds another layer. Dozens of transformation units are equipped to improve quality and reduce post-harvest losses, particularly in rice. Tens of thousands of tons are processed, with a portion directed to national distribution channels. Reported revenues from processing activities indicate that value capture is beginning to move upstream, benefiting local actors rather than remaining concentrated at import or wholesale levels. Even without full market penetration, the signal is clear. Domestic production is being treated as an economic system, not just a subsistence activity. Aquaculture introduces a different metric. Floating cages installed on major reservoirs expand protein production capacity with relatively low land pressure. With multiple production cycles per year, projected output reaches into the thousands of tons. Training accompanies equipment deployment, reducing the risk of idle assets. The emphasis again is on pairing hardware with human capacity, a recurring design choice across sectors. Health indicators are more indirect but still quantifiable. Dozens of communal medical centers are under construction or conversion, alongside specialized units for intensive care, dialysis, and diagnostics. Equipment investments measured in hundreds of millions of CFA francs aim to reduce referrals and evacuations. The delta here is expected over time: shorter travel distances, lower out-of-pocket costs, and improved treatment continuity. Early indicators focus on infrastructure completion and staffing readiness rather than patient outcomes, which lag by design. Education and transport show similar patterns. New lecture halls, integrated school complexes, and hundreds of buses expand access rather than reform pedagogy immediately. The measurable change is capacity, seats, classrooms, mobility. Outcomes will depend on utilization and maintenance. Ibrahim Traore is invoked in presenting these figures as proof of resolve rather than final success. The numbers function as credibility markers. They show that resources are moving, assets are being deployed, and systems are being activated. Whether these deltas compound into long-term productivity gains depends on follow-through, but the quantitative baseline has clearly shifted. Any serious assessment of these initiatives has to engage with the strongest counter-arguments, not just the supportive narrative. The first critique centers on sustainability. Skeptics argue that heavy subsidies, rapid construction, and centralized coordination risk creating short-term gains without long-term viability. Tractors, medical equipment, or buses can be deployed quickly, but maintenance, staffing, and replacement costs accumulate quietly. If fiscal pressure tightens or political attention shifts, these assets could degrade faster than institutions can absorb them. A second counterpoint focuses on governance and capacity. By layering presidential initiatives over existing ministries, the system may blur accountability rather than strengthen it. When results are positive, credit flows upward. When delays or failures occur, responsibility can become diffuse. Critics warn that this structure might discourage ministries from building their own planning and evaluation capabilities, relying instead on exceptional mechanisms that cannot be permanent by design. There is also a social risk. Mobilization fatigue is real. Community participation works when people see tangible returns for their effort. If some regions experience repeated calls for engagement without commensurate benefits, trust can erode. Early unevenness, already visible between urban centers and more insecure rural zones, could harden into perceptions of favoritism or neglect. Once that narrative takes hold, participation becomes harder to sustain. The response to these critiques rests largely on sequencing and intent. Supporters argue that the initiatives are explicitly framed as accelerators, not replacements. Their purpose is to unblock bottlenecks, demonstrate feasibility, and reset expectations. Maintenance and institutionalization are not denied. They are deferred to later phases once momentum and legitimacy are established. In this view, demanding full optimization upfront would have guaranteed paralysis under current constraints. On subsidies, the defense emphasizes targeting and transition. Input support is presented as a bridge, not a permanent entitlement. The expectation is that productivity gains, local processing, and market integration will gradually reduce dependence on state support. Whether this transition is managed effectively remains an open question, but the logic is internally consistent. Ibrahim Traore appears in this debate less as a shield against criticism than as a focal point of responsibility. By tying disparate initiatives to a single political vision, he concentrates both credit and risk. If the model stabilizes and adapts, that concentration becomes an asset. If it fails to evolve, it becomes a liability. The steelman position accepts the risks, but argues that under conditions of insecurity and urgency, controlled overreach may be preferable to cautious stagnation. Midway through, it becomes easier to see what initially looked like a sector-by-sector push. The initiatives are not primarily about maximizing output in agriculture, health, or education taken separately. They are about rebuilding the habit of coordinated execution across the state, communities, and semi-autonomous programs. Each sector becomes a testing ground for the same operating logic: fast mobilization, visible delivery, and shared responsibility between institutions and citizens. This matters because it shifts the evaluation lens. The success metric is not only tons produced, classrooms built, or clinics opened. It is whether actors learn to work together under pressure and then repeat that cooperation at lower cost. Seen this way, uneven rollout is less a failure than a diagnostic tool, revealing where coordination breaks down and where it holds. Ibrahim Traoré's role at this midpoint appears less about expansion and more about consolidation. The challenge is no longer proving that action is possible, but deciding which mechanisms are worth standardizing and which should be retired once the signal has been sent. Put simply, momentum is the real infrastructure. From here, the story moves from execution to consequence, as early design choices begin to shape everyday realities beyond the launch phase. The practical consequences of the initiatives become clearest when broken down by who actually feels the change. For the state, the immediate effect is operational. Ministries and local administrations gain assets, personnel support, and political cover to act faster than before. Clinics under construction, road brigades, and coordinated agricultural campaigns reduce the gap between decision and delivery. This does not eliminate structural weaknesses, but it compresses response time, which matters in a context of insecurity and social pressure. For businesses and local economic actors, the impact is more uneven but tangible. Agricultural processors benefit first, as subsidized inputs and higher volumes improve supply reliability. Rice transformation units, for example, move from sporadic operation toward continuous activity, allowing investment in quality control and distribution. Construction and transport-related initiatives generate short-term demand for materials, labor, and logistics services. However, private actors remain cautious. Many wait to see whether public demand stabilizes before committing long-term capital, especially in regions where security remains fragile. For citizens, the effects are most visible in access and cost. Communal medical centers shorten travel distances and reduce referral expenses even before specialized services reach full capacity. Mobile clinics and diagnostic equipment lower barriers to basic care. In education, new classrooms, lecture halls, and transport buses expand physical access rather than immediately improving learning outcomes. The benefit is time and predictability. Fewer missed classes, fewer deferred treatments, fewer abandoned projects. These are modest gains individually, but they accumulate in daily life. At the regional level, the initiatives send a signal beyond borders. They project an image of internal consolidation at a time when the Sahel is often framed through crisis alone. This does not translate automatically into diplomatic leverage or investment inflows, but it alters expectations. Neighbors and partners observe a state attempting to act coherently despite constraints, which can reshape negotiations over aid, security cooperation, and trade. Throughout these layers, Ibrahim Traoré remains a reference point rather than a direct actor. His presence ties outcomes together politically, ensuring that successes and failures are read as parts of a single trajectory. The real test now lies in distribution. If benefits continue to concentrate in visible hubs, legitimacy may erode. If they diffuse gradually and predictably, even at a slower pace, the initiatives could redefine what normal progress looks like under pressure. This balance between reach and patience will determine whether early momentum hardens into durable social confidence. Looking 6 to 12 months ahead, 3 broad scenarios emerge, each shaped less by intent than by execution discipline. In the base scenario, momentum stabilizes. Core initiatives continue at a manageable pace with fewer new launches and more emphasis on completing, staffing and maintaining what is already underway. Agricultural input support narrows to priority zones. Health centers move from construction to routine service, and road brigades focus on consolidation rather than expansion. Progress feels slower, but credibility improves as systems catch up with assets. The optimistic scenario assumes coordination improves faster than expected. Ministries absorb the initiative logic, community participation remains high, and monitoring mechanisms begin to filter out weaker projects. In this path, early visibility translates into learning effects. Costs fall, duplication declines, and delivery becomes more predictable. External partners respond cautiously but positively, aligning support with demonstrated capacity rather than promises. The initiatives shift from exception to template. The worst-case scenario is defined by overload. Too many projects remain active simultaneously, stretching fiscal and human resources. Maintenance legs, staffing gaps widen, and uneven regional delivery hardens into frustration. Community fatigue sets in as participation demands outpace perceived returns. In this case, political ownership concentrated around Ibrahim Traoré amplifies pressure, making adjustment harder without appearing to retreat. Across all three paths, the key variable is not ambition but sequencing. The strategic question is which initiatives are institutionalized, which are paused, and which are allowed to end. Managing the choice transparently will matter more than announcing the next program. For viewers trying to connect these initiatives to their own lives, the relevance depends on position and proximity. For rural households, especially those engaged in farming, the most immediate touchpoint is risk reduction. Subsidized inputs, access to mechanization, and local processing options reduce uncertainty from one season to the next. Even when yields do not surge dramatically, predictability itself becomes a form of security. Knowing that seeds, fertilizer, or basic services will arrive on time changes how families plan labor, schooling, and spending. For urban residents, the connection is often indirect but still tangible. Health centers closer to neighborhoods reduce time lost to travel and waiting. Roadworks, sanitation campaigns, and urban beautification alter daily routines rather than income directly. These changes rarely feel transformative on their own, but they lower friction in everyday life. Over time, that friction reduction shapes perceptions of whether institutions are present or absent. Young people experience the initiatives through opportunity signals. Training programs, temporary jobs, and participation in community projects offer entry points into economic and civic life, even if they are not permanent solutions. The value lies less in immediate earnings and more in exposure to skills, networks, and a sense of inclusion. For some, this creates a bridge. For others, it remains a holding pattern, highlighting the limits of short-term engagement without private sector absorption. Women's engagement varies by sector. In agriculture and processing, targeted support can translate into income and autonomy. In health and education, improved access reduces care burdens and opportunity costs. However, these gains depend heavily on continuity. Interruptions or uneven rollout disproportionately affect those already managing time and resource constraints. Across these groups, the initiatives are felt not as abstract policy, but as a test of reliability. The central question people ask is simple. Does participation today make tomorrow easier or harder? The answer is still forming. Early signals are mixed but meaningful enough to keep attention engaged, which in itself is a scarce resource. A workable path forward depends less on adding new initiatives and more on stabilizing those already in motion. The first step is clarification of roles. Each program needs a clear handoff from presidential impulse to ministerial routine, with defined responsibility for maintenance, staffing, and budgeting. Without the transition, speed remains dependent on constant political attention, which is not sustainable. The second step is selective measurement. Not every output needs complex indicators, but each initiative requires a small set of signals that show whether it is being used, maintained, and valued locally. For agriculture, that may mean repeat participation by producers rather than expansion alone. For health and education, it means utilization rates and staffing continuity, not just buildings completed. Measurement should be light but consistent, enabling course correction without slowing delivery. Third, sequencing must become explicit. Some initiatives should be paused or closed once their signaling function is complete. Others, especially those tied to food security and basic services, deserve protection even under fiscal stress. Making these choices transparent reduces rumor and resentment, especially in areas scheduled to receive support later. Fourth, community participation needs recalibration. Voluntary mobilization works best when demands are predictable and time-bound. Clear cycles of engagement, rest, and feedback prevent fatigue while preserving ownership. This requires local intermediaries with real authority, not just symbolic committees. Finally, external alignment matters. Partners and donors should be invited to plug into functioning mechanisms rather than parallel projects. This reinforces national ownership while easing resource pressure. Taken together, this roadmap treats the initiatives as a transition phase, not a permanent structure. The objective is simple: convert momentum into routines that survive attention shifts and political cycles. The story circles back to the early scenes of community work and shared effort, where participation mattered as much as output. What began with cleaning campaigns, small road repairs, or collective contributions gradually took on symbolic weight. These were not just projects, but rehearsals for cooperation under strain. The emotional core of the initiative sits there, in ordinary actions framed as national contribution. In this closing arc, Ibrahim Traoré reappears not as an announcer of new programs, but as the figure who tied those first gestures together. His name became shorthand for permission to act, even when resources were thin and outcomes uncertain. That symbolic role carries both strength and risk. It can unify disparate efforts, but it also concentrates expectation around continuity and follow-through. What lingers most is not a single metric or sectoral win, but a shared reference point. People were asked to believe that effort today would matter tomorrow, even if results arrived unevenly. Whether that belief endures depends on what happens next, not on what has already been launched. Put in one line, trust grows where action repeats. If the initiatives mature into routine practice, that trust may deepen. If they fade, the memory of collective effort will still shape how future calls to mobilize are received. The closing move is intentionally soft, because the real decision does not belong to institutions alone. It belongs to how society interprets what has just unfolded. Presidential initiatives can open space, move resources, and set direction, but their lasting effect depends on whether citizens, professionals, and local leaders adjust their expectations of what is possible and what is normal. If participation becomes habitual rather than exceptional, the legacy outlives any single program. At this point, Ibrahim Traoré functions less as a policymaker and more as a reference symbol. His role anchors the narrative, but the future weight shifts towards systems that operate without constant signaling. The question is no longer whether initiatives can be launched, but whether they can quietly persist, adapt, and correct themselves when attention moves elsewhere. For observers, the invitation is simple. Watch what is maintained, not what is announced. Notice where routines replace slogans and where communities continue acting even when cameras leave. That is where trajectory becomes visible. So the final question is open-ended by design. When momentum fades from headlines, will the practices it sparked remain part of everyday governance, or will they dissolve back into exception?